Imagine an army so long that if you stood at its rear, you might not even see where it begins. Now imagine that this army isn't just a line of soldiers, but an entire city on the move. A city with smoking kitchens, tents being packed at dawn, medics treating wounds, engineers hauling tools, and even merchants selling bread and wine in the middle of the march. In this video you'll step inside the moving machine that was a Roman legion on the march, hour by hour, step by step. And by the end you may find yourself asking, could I even survive a single day walking beside the soldiers of Rome? Before we understand how a Roman march worked, we have to face the numbers, and they're staggering. During the High Empire, a typical campaign force could include 2 full legions, roughly 13,000 to 14,000 highly trained legionaries. But they weren't alone. Marching with them were 5,000 to 6,000 auxiliary troops, Numidian cavalry, Syrian archers, Germanic infantry, slingers from Hispania, soldiers who weren't Roman citizens, but who fought for Rome in exchange for pay and the promise of citizenship. Right there we're talking about nearly 20,000 armed men, each drilled to move, fight, and survive with unwavering discipline. Now add those who made everything work behind the scenes, 3,000 to 4,000 cooks, slaves, servants, and military laborers. These individuals didn't fight on the front lines, but without them, the legion would fall apart. They cared for the animals, cooked meals, repaired armor and weapons, maintained carts, dug ditches, and helped pitch and dismantle tents with mechanical precision. Many were technically part of the army itself, enrolled as logistical staff or assigned to senior officers. Others were privately owned slaves who followed their masters across provinces, battlefields, and continents. Their labor kept the war machine running day after day. And speaking of equipment, it's estimated that a marching army brought along between 4,500 and 5,000 mules, in addition to the horses of officers, cavalrymen, messengers, and scouts. Each animal could carry up to 130 kilograms of gear, and this included everything from wooden stakes and entrenching tools to sacks of grain, bundles of firewood, tents, cauldrons, spare boots, siege engines, and even disassembled ballistae and scorpions. Carts groaned under the weight of construction tools, portable forges, spare weapons, and barrels of wine or vinegar used to disinfect water. A typical legion moved like a fortified caravan that could set up a new stronghold each night without missing a step. Add it all together, and you have a force of 25,000 to 30,000 living beings on the move: men, horses, mules, oxen, carts, and weapons. And that's not counting civilian merchants who often followed the army to sell goods, local guides hired for regional knowledge, or temporary messengers moving between nearby towns, forts, or allied units. The entire enterprise functioned like a small state on the march, with its own economy, security, logistics, and communications. The historian Polybius once described the legion's march as a moving wall of flesh, and he wasn't exaggerating. A legion in motion could stretch for 8 to 12 kilometers down a road or path, depending on the terrain. The philosopher Eugenius warned that on the Roman march, formation and coordination mattered more than bravery in battle. If cohesion was lost, even the most valiant warrior was useless. The head of the column could be crossing a river while the rear was still tearing down tents from the previous night's camp. That kind of scale created a serious logistical challenge. How do you move a living, breathing monster like that every single day without it collapsing under its own weight? That's what we'll see, starting with the next Roman morning. The March of Rome began when the world was still asleep, between 3 and 4 in the morning, during the 4th watch of the night. This early start allowed them to cover maximum ground during the cooler parts of the day and reach the next campsite in time to build fortifications before nightfall. The first sound that broke the silence wasn't shouting or clanging metal, but the muffled gallop of horses. These belonged to the speculators, the elite reconnaissance unit of the legion. More than ordinary scouts, these men were selected for their sharp eyes, quick reflexes, and mental toughness. They rode out ahead of the column well before dawn, tasked with evaluating the day's route. Their job was to detect enemy ambushes, spot difficult terrain, investigate suspicious villages or ruins, and ensure the path ahead remained clear and safe for the main force. Without their vigilance, the entire legion could walk blindly into a trap. Meanwhile, back at the previous night's camp, the centurions were waking their men. A brief but sharp blast from the cornu, a curved brass horn, signaled the start of preparations. Nothing was chaotic or improvised. Each contubernium, a unit of 8 legionaries who lived and marched together, had an exact process. They packed up their leather tents, checked and secured their weapons, rolled up sleeping cloaks and cleaned their armor. They inspected their caligae, the military sandals, ensuring the soles were nailed tight for long distances. Perhaps most critically, every soldier carried his own burden. There were no carts for personal belongings. Each legionary bore between 20 and 30 kilograms of gear. This included his gladius short sword, scutum shield, peeler, javelins, rations for 3 days, a waterskin, cooking tools, a pot or pan, extra clothing, and wooden stakes for building the knight's fortifications. They were not only trained to fight, but to march, dig, build and survive. The Roman soldier was his own mule, cook, and engineer. While the rank and file prepared their gear, the high command gathered. Inside the command tent, the legatus legionis, senior tribunes, and military engineers met to review intelligence collected during the night. Messengers and returning scouts relayed details about terrain, nearby villages, weather conditions, and any detected enemy activity. Based on that information, commanders decided the day's route. They avoided known marshlands, steep hills, dense forests, or narrow passes whenever possible. The goal was always the same: keep the column moving steadily, with minimal disruption, while avoiding unnecessary risk. Changes were then quickly relayed to each cohort by mounted couriers or trusted aides. At that same hour, hundreds of animals were being prepared, mules were fed and watered, their loads were checked, tightened and redistributed to avoid injury or imbalance. Carts were inspected for broken axles, weakened wheels, or missing pins. The impedimenta, the supply and logistics train, had to be ready before the soldiers even left camp. If one cart broke down on a narrow trail or a load was forgotten, the entire column could grind to a halt. Just before sunrise, the head of the column began to move. The departure was not accompanied by shouting or fanfare. Discipline demanded silence. Talking was limited to essential orders. Laughing, singing, or calling out across ranks was forbidden. The goal was stealth, control, and focus. Rome advanced like a predator, seen only when it was too late. At the very front, where the road was uncertain and threats were most likely, marched the vanguard. This was not just a handful of scouts or a random group of soldiers. It was a carefully selected force, fast, experienced and versatile. Rome had learned through blood that a sudden ambush at the front could destroy an entire army if warnings did not reach the main body in time. The vanguard, therefore, was composed of elite auxiliary troops, non-citizens, but among the fiercest and most agile fighters in the empire. Numidian horsemen, known for their speed and mobility, Thracian light cavalry, who could dart through forests and hills with precision, Gauls with deep hunting instincts and a sense for terrain, Cretans and Syrians, equipped with powerful composite bows, capable of striking from a distance with deadly accuracy. These men weren't just scouts. They were Rome's first responders, trained to observe, engage, withdraw, or hold long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Their presence at the front wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. They were the sharp edge of the spear, protecting the thousands who followed behind. Protecting the core of that forward line were light infantry, men who wore minimal armor, carried only essential weapons, and remained ready to move at a moment's notice. They were agile, disciplined, and lightly burdened, selected not for brute strength, but for speed and awareness. These soldiers didn't charge into battle blindly. Their task was to stay alert, respond instantly, and remain elusive if needed. They advanced ahead of the main body, scanning the landscape, assessing terrain features, and ensuring that every stretch of road the Legion would cross was secure. Their mission was both simple and dangerous: keep the road open, safe, and free of threats before the slower-moving mass of troops arrived. That meant confronting ambushes laid by local tribes, dismantling makeshift traps like spiked pits, tripline log mechanisms, or concealed trenches, and inspecting villages that seemed deserted but could mask enemy fighters. They often had to make judgment calls without waiting for higher command, striking fast or falling back when necessary, keeping the danger contained to the edge and preventing it from spilling into the heart of the army. But the Vanguard's role extended far beyond direct engagement. It acted as the Legion's early warning system. In thick forested regions like Germania, where visibility could be reduced to a few dozen paces and roads twisted through dense trees, the Vanguard might operate 2 to 3 kilometers ahead of the nearest cohort. That space was critical. It provided a buffer zone where danger could be identified and reported in time, where retreat could be managed in an orderly fashion, and where signals could be passed back without triggering confusion among the rear formations. This gap was not just about safety, it was about strategic time. It gave the commanders precious minutes to issue new orders or reposition their troops if necessary. Ancient military writers like Vegetius and Tacitus often emphasized how vital this structure was. If a vanguard was overwhelmed, the rest of the army risked falling into disorder. In long, vulnerable columns, a surprise attack at the front could lead to chaos spreading backward like a wave, especially if messengers failed to reach the command center in time. The loss of coordination in those moments often meant not just defeat but massacre. The vanguard was therefore Rome's first line of defense, but also its most fragile. It needed to hold long enough for the machine behind it to react. Because of this, Rome placed only its most reliable men in that position. These weren't green recruits or untested auxiliaries. They were hardened veterans, often with decades of campaign experience. Many had served in multiple provinces and fought under different generals. They were given a degree of tactical autonomy rare in the Roman system. Their orders were clear, but their method of execution depended on instinct and expertise. They had to read signs in the earth, interpret tracks, evaluate wind direction for smoke, and detect subtle cues that a civilian settlement had turned hostile. These men were the tip of the spear, and if they fell, the rest of the weapon never reached its target. Just behind this line of hardened warriors came a group that looked far less imposing but was just as critical: the agrimensors, the military surveyors. Their equipment was simple: a groma for straight lines, a coro baits for leveling stakes, ropes, and sighting tools. But what they accomplished with these basic instruments shaped the fate of armies. These men weren't fighters, but their impact on battlefield readiness was immense. Before the soldiers arrived, before a single fire was lit or a gate planned, the agrimensors had already chosen the exact location where thousands would eat, sleep, and defend their lives. They were trained in both geometry and terrain analysis. Their job was to read the lay of the land with the eyes of a builder and the mind of a strategist. They scouted for fresh water, calculated elevation, ensured natural drainage, evaluated soil firmness for digging, and assessed access to timber and stone for reinforcement. A good site had to allow both a quick defense and long-term occupation if needed, and there was no time for deliberation. The decision had to be made within hours, often based on scouting reports, instinct, and the ticking pressure of a marching army closing in. Marching near the surveyors was the command corps of the legion. The legatus legion, commander of the legion, and often a senator by rank, held a mobile headquarters surrounded by his cohors praetoria, his personal guard. He did not travel with the main body, nor linger in the rear. His position was carefully chosen, slightly apart from the marching ranks, yet centrally located to maintain rapid contact with all sides of the column. Around him rode the senior military tribunes, strategists, and administrative aides responsible for managing communication, decision-making, and discipline. From this mobile nerve center, orders were drafted, relayed, and enforced. When scouts returned with updates, decisions were made immediately. If a road had collapsed, if a river proved impassable, or if enemy movements were detected in nearby woods, the command group adjusted the route, changed marching order, or deployed troops preemptively. Every order issued was time-sensitive, and delay meant vulnerability. The system relied on a steady flow of information and swift reaction. Horse messengers, called cursories, acted as the bloodstream of this command structure. They rode back and forth along the flanks, cutting through the forest edge, fording shallow rivers, or galloping up narrow ridgelines to deliver sealed orders to centurions, flank commanders, or the rear guard. These orders were often coded or written in brief, unmistakable language. The messengers themselves were trained to memorize fallback positions, passwords, and hand signals in case communication needed to happen in silence. Writers such as Frontinus described several historical instances where the mere choice of campsite decided the fate of an entire operation. In Gaul, during Caesar's campaigns, a poorly chosen lowland led to the camp being flooded overnight. In the east, overlooking a nearby hill resulted in surprise attacks at dawn. In northern provinces, a shallow river assumed to be a natural barrier failed to deter local raiders, leading to a breach that cost hundreds of lives. These weren't just mishaps. They were cautionary tales embedded in Rome's institutional memory, and every surveyor, every commander, carried those lessons with them. What's most remarkable is that all this wasn't an extraordinary effort. It was standard procedure. This level of foresight, calculation, and coordination occurred every single day. March after march, regardless of the region, the climate, or the threat, Rome executed the same mechanical routine with relentless precision. Their campaign playbook wasn't just a set of suggestions, it was a doctrine carved into the bones of the army. And then came the largest, most visible, and perhaps most awe-inspiring part of the legion on the march, the main body. This was the lifeblood of Rome's military power. Within this massive block marched the legionaries themselves, grizzled veterans, newly trained recruits, tactical reserves, and specialist units. Alongside them were support staff, cooks, medics, armorers, beast handlers, and various slaves, often doubling as camp builders or orderlies. This core force numbered around 13,000 legionaries, divided into 10 cohorts per legion, each containing 6 centuries of 80 men. The structure was rigid, but within it, each man had his place and purpose. Around this core marched nearly 4,000 more, civilians and workers, who kept the machine turning. Their tools, wagons, animals and cargo accompanied the soldiers every step of the way. Thousands of mules plodded alongside them, each loaded with rations, tools, or spare equipment. These animals were not simply pack beasts, they were part of the army's daily survival plan. What made this spectacle truly extraordinary wasn't just its scale, but the order with which it moved. The Roman army advanced with a level of discipline that most modern forces would still admire. Each century had its designated spot in the column. The oldest, most reliable soldiers took the lead, setting the pace and maintaining formation. Recruits were placed in the center, where their inexperience could be tempered by surrounding veterans. Problematic or undisciplined soldiers were deliberately assigned to the rear, where centurions could keep a close eye on them. The formation wasn't spread out in battle ranks, but moved in a compact, elongated column, often just 2 or 3 men wide. This configuration allowed the army to move through mountain passes, across ridges, or along winding river valleys, without losing contact or cohesion. In rough terrain, flexibility was everything. Each man knew who stood beside him, who followed behind, and where to report if something went wrong. Along the entire column, rode officers and mounted couriers. They communicated using trumpet signals, visual signs, or direct instruction. Cornu players stood at designated intervals, prepared to blow commands, halt, double pace, form lines, without breaking the flow of the march. But none of this worked unless the men could carry the load. Each soldier was weighed down with 20 to 30 kilograms of gear. His armor, often lorica segmenta or chainmail, was worn daily, whether battle was expected or not. He carried a scutum, a large curved shield, a gladius for close combat, 2 pila for throwing, stakes for the nightly camp palisade, a small shovel or pickaxe, cooking gear, personal belongings, and rations. Water skins hung from his belt. Some carried grinding stones to prepare flour, others knives or sewing kits. Their burdens were as personal as they were standardized. Some were enslaved, others hired. Many had accompanied the same legion through multiple campaigns, surviving deserts, forests, and frozen rivers, and over time, they became as familiar with military discipline and procedure as any trained soldier. Though technically non-combatants, these individuals functioned as essential cogs in the Roman military apparatus. They weren't just tolerated, they were depended upon. Their roles might have been humble, but their presence was vital, and their integration into the army's rhythm made them functionally indistinguishable from the troops they supported. Yet despite the baggage train's central role, it remained one of the slowest moving parts of the entire column. The carts were heavily laden, the animals frequently overworked, and the terrain often unforgiving. A steep hill, a narrow pass, or even a sudden change in weather could stall progress. Because of this, the train's placement in the march was always carefully considered. It was most often nestled in the middle of the formation or immediately behind the main body, where it could be shielded from direct assault by both the forward legions and the ever-watchful rear guard. Along its flanks, patrols moved constantly to ensure no one approached undetected. A single mistake could cascade into disaster. If one cart wheel snapped, or a load tipped into a ravine, or a mule fell lame in a narrow mountain path, the entire march could grind to a halt. The Roman army didn't tolerate such disruptions lightly. Historian Flavius Josephus, in his writings on the campaigns of Titus in Judea, describes how orders concerning the baggage train were enforced with the same severity as battlefield regulations. Soldiers and servants alike were forbidden to tamper with supplies, redistribute cargo, or make unauthorized decisions. If a servant attempted to lighten a load or abandon a broken cart without permission, they could be beaten, imprisoned, or even executed, depending on the circumstances and urgency of the campaign. Within the baggage train traveled more than just supplies. It carried essential personnel who, though rarely fighting on the front lines, were crucial to sustaining a functioning force. Medics moved with basic surgical tools, scalpels, forceps, cauterization equipment, and ointments made from vinegar, honey, and herbs. They treated wounds during halts or overnight. Campaign cooks brought portable mills for grinding grain into flour, kettles for boiling, and pans for baking simple loaves. Blacksmiths rode with mobile forges, ready to mend weapons or fix damaged armor. Scribes maintained scrolls of orders, rosters, and ration logs. Translators and interpreters, especially in foreign territories, helped communicate with locals and gather information. There were even animal specialists, veterinarians in all but name, who ensured that the mules and horses remained fit to march. Spare animals also traveled with the train. Rome understood that beasts could drop dead from exhaustion or injury at any time. Losing one pack mule might mean leaving behind a vital cargo of medical supplies or siege components. Thus, replacement animals were always brought along, even at the cost of added burden. Protecting all this was a military priority of the highest order. In contested lands, entire detachments of auxiliary infantry and cavalry were assigned exclusively to the baggage train's defense. These weren't afterthoughts, they were calculated investments. The survival of the legion depended on it. Without the train, the soldiers had no food, no tools for camp construction, no medical care, and no way to transport the sick and wounded. A legion without its baggage wasn't a fighting force, it was a target, an exhausted crowd, ready to be wiped out by any organized resistance. If the vanguard served as the army's eyes, and the baggage train was its lifeline, then the rear guard acted as its invisible armor. This was the barrier that ensured the tail of the army didn't unravel under pressure. Marching in the rear was not seen as a punishment, but as a duty for seasoned troops, who could maintain focus and discipline in the face of constant uncertainty. Unlike the front, where threats could be seen from a distance, the rear operated under tension, always aware that an unseen enemy might emerge from the terrain behind. The composition of the rear guard was dynamic. Rotating units ensured fatigue never dulled its effectiveness. Auxiliary archers provided ranged support in case of ambush, while light cavalry maintained mobility and rapid reaction capability. Foot soldiers, often chosen from the hardier cohorts, patrolled the edges, watched for deserters, and dealt with any signs of disorder. Their responsibilities extended beyond just defense. They gathered stragglers who fell behind due to exhaustion or injury, handled broken equipment or damaged carts until help could arrive, and maintained constant vigilance along the column's edge. But perhaps the greatest threat was psychological, not physical. A well-placed attack, or even the suggestion of one, could send panic rippling forward. Servants, animals, and auxiliaries might scatter. A trumpet call misheard or a scream misunderstood could dissolve discipline faster than any weapon. The rear guard had to remain absolutely calm, even in chaos. Because of this danger, Rome treated discipline in the rear with the same severity as on the battlefield. Soldiers caught deserting, especially from the tail end of the march, faced immediate punishment. During high-risk campaigns, some were executed on the spot. As an example, Roman command understood that fear, once sparked at the rear, could tear apart the entire force before a single enemy spear was thrown. The consequences of failure were seared into Roman memory. The most infamous example was the ambush in the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD, where 3 entire legions under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varus were annihilated. Germanic tribes exploited poor visibility, rough terrain, and the long vulnerable column to attack from the sides and rear. There was no time to regroup, no space to maneuver, and no warning from the front. The failure to maintain cohesion between the vanguard and rear guard led to one of the worst disasters in Roman military history. From that catastrophe onward, rear guard doctrine evolved. No longer were these soldiers merely reactionary, they became proactive. In dangerous regions, the rear was reinforced with its own scouts, light cavalry outriders, engineers for rapid fortification if attacked, and dedicated messengers who ensured the command center remained in contact with the rear at all times. They didn't just shield the end, they scouted it, mapped it, and anticipated every possible threat. While the rear sealed the marching order, another group operated beyond the visible lanes of the road. They weren't assigned to the front or back. Instead, they moved independently through the shadows of the landscape, covering the outer edges of the marching line. These were the flank guards, the quiet guardians of the army's most vulnerable sides. Because while the Roman column could stretch 10 kilometers or more, its sides were almost always exposed. The central route might be fortified by formation, but anything off the trail, wooded hills, ravines, tall grasslands, or narrow riverbanks, offered a perfect hiding place for ambushers. The flanks were, by nature, unpredictable, and so Rome turned to its most mobile and autonomous troops to keep them secure. Flank guard patrols moved ahead of, beside, and occasionally far beyond the column's edges. They ventured into woods, scaled rocky ridges, patrolled across stream beds, and passed through farms or towns before the army arrived. Their job was not just to observe but to interpret: the path of trampled grass, a set of fresh footprints, a quickly abandoned campfire, all signs of potential threats that the core army could not see in time. These patrols were composed largely of auxiliary light cavalry, swift-moving Numidians used to desert terrain, Thracians comfortable in forested slopes, Iberians raised in mountain villages. Their mounts were smaller and faster than standard cavalry horses, trained to navigate rough and uneven terrain without hesitation. Supporting them were detachments of lightly equipped infantry, who moved silently and could respond rapidly if ambushed themselves. These soldiers carried minimal gear, wore lighter armor, and were trained to use the terrain to their advantage. In territories like Germania or Dacia, where Rome's knowledge of the terrain was limited, local Allied scouts were often recruited. These men, familiar with every twist in the trail, every hidden glade or rocky pass, provided insight that no map could offer. Though not always trusted fully, their guidance could mean the difference between a safe passage and an ambush site. The demands on flank guards were punishing. They often covered longer distances than the legion itself. They operated without a fixed pace, adjusted constantly to the land, and had to function with minimal rest. They sometimes ate cold meals during brief halts, slept in isolated outposts, and reported back only at intervals. Yet, their role was absolutely vital. They didn't just protect the column from attack, they protected its very structure, ensuring that the long, fragile line didn't fold inward or become surrounded. Caesar's writings on the Gallic Wars highlight several instances where flanking patrols uncovered ambushes in time to allow the army to avoid or neutralize them. In the mountains of Britannia, entire detachments were sent forward just to investigate the sides of valleys and ensure no enemy lay in wait behind the ridge lines. One mistake by a flank patrol could cost hundreds of lives. One missed signal, one overlooked trail, and the enemy would find the perfect opening. That's why only trusted, experienced soldiers were ever placed on these details, those capable of thinking independently, reacting without orders, and reading both land and intent. First came the ditch, a defensive trench carved quickly around the selected perimeter. It was typically 2 meters deep and about 3 meters wide. Its purpose was twofold: both a physical obstacle to slow any attacker and a psychological boundary that marked Roman presence. The earth removed during its digging was not discarded but deliberately thrown inward, forming an embankment that served as the base for further defenses. On that mound, the soldiers planted the sharpened wooden stakes they carried with them, each man responsible for several. These stakes, known as valli, were not just part of standard gear. They were a symbol of Roman preparedness. No legionary was ever sent on campaign without them. They were as vital as his sword or shield, used to raise a wall from nothing wherever the army chose to stop. After the ditch and mound were completed, the engineers, led by the agrimensors and coordinated by experienced centurions, laid out the camp's 4 main gates. These were not random openings but carefully aligned passages with strict names and functions. The Porta Praetoria faced the direction of travel and served as the main gate, while the Porta Decumana opened at the rear. On either side, the Porta Sinistra and Porta Dextra allowed for lateral movement. Even before the walls were completed, guards were posted at each of these gates, alert and ready, because Roman doctrine never assumed safety, not even for an hour. Inside the marked perimeter, the layout followed a pre-established plan practiced countless times. The entire legion divided itself by quadrant. Tents were pitched according to strict rank and roll, never at random. The centurions and senior officers were given prime central positions, forming a hardened core. Regular legionaries occupied the flanks in rows of uniform tents, organized by centuries and cohorts. Auxiliary troops, non-citizen soldiers who often performed specialized combat roles, were assigned to separate but adjacent zones. Baggage animals, carts and support personnel were directed to clearly defined areas, often near the rear or close to their assigned units. At the very heart of the camp stood the praetorium, the commander's tent. Far more than just a temporary shelter, it was the operational brain of the entire force. A portable altar stood nearby or directly within it, and as soon as it was erected, ritual sacrifices were performed. These acts were not symbolic, they were deeply serious moments of religious and strategic importance. Omens were read from animal entrails, the gods consulted, and prayers offered for safe passage or favorable conditions. Within the tent, maps were unrolled, scouts debriefed, and orders finalized. High-ranking officers met in council, often under torchlight, to discuss enemy movements, terrain obstacles, or route changes. The internal structure of the camp was as ordered as a Roman city. Streets ran in straight, perpendicular lines, wide enough to allow cohorts to form up or shift position quickly if attacked. Key areas like granaries, armament storage zones, workshops and kitchens were clearly marked. Even latrines were given careful consideration. They were dug at precise distances from the tents, aligned with the wind, and maintained with a level of hygiene unheard of in most ancient armies. Latrine trenches were flushed regularly with water or ash, and sponges soaked in vinegar replaced more primitive sanitation methods. To the Romans, cleanliness wasn't a luxury, it was strategy. Disease was a greater killer than the sword, and they knew it. The most astonishing part of this massive operation is that it was all completed in less than 4 hours. Thousands of men, operating like parts of a single mechanism, worked quickly and efficiently. Each task was already assigned. Every soldier knew his role. This process wasn't adapted to the situation, it was the situation. Authors like Vigetius and Josephus both emphasized this ability to construct a fully fortified military city on demand as one of the key reasons behind Rome's military dominance. Where enemy forces often spent their nights scattered, vulnerable, exposed to weather or surprise attacks, Roman legions slept behind structured defenses, armed, organized, and with multiple contingencies in place. And this wasn't optional. Even if the army only intended to rest for a single night, even in territory already secured or among friendly allies, the doctrine remained the same. The perimeter was dug, the walls built, the gates guarded. This discipline became so ingrained in Roman military identity that to skip fortification was considered outright negligence. Fortifying was not just for defense, it was psychological warfare. Any potential enemy seeing the construction of a Roman camp would know that this army was not only ready to fight, but prepared to do so in perfect order. It was this ritualized repetition, this almost religious adherence to structure, that gave Rome an unmatched ability to sustain campaigns far from home. The legion didn't need cities, forts, or garrisons. It brought its own fortress. It brought its own city. Wherever it stopped, Rome existed. But when the last stake was driven, the final tent was secured, and the guards rotated into their watch, a deep and deliberate silence settled over the entire encampment. That silence was not rest. It was tension, because night was not a time for peace. It marked the start of another kind of operation entirely. In most ancient armies, darkness was a respite, a chance for music, stories, or revelry. But in a Roman camp, Nightfall signaled the beginning of a new, tightly controlled phase. The soldiers received their rations in strict portions, usually a mix of raw wheat grains, coarse salt, vinegar, and dried meat if available. They ground the wheat using small portable mills kept among their personal equipment and boiled it into a heavy porridge known as pulse. No spices, no luxury, just nourishment. Some mixed vinegar with water to make posca, a sour, rehydrating drink that became the hallmark of the Roman fighting man. At the same time, medics moved between the tents, tending to the wounded. They washed cuts with vinegar, applied honey as a natural antibiotic, set broken bones with splints carved from wood or bone, and dressed burns or blisters. Injuries were common, not just from combat, but from the march itself. Feet blistered, backs strained, joints inflamed. The army didn't wait for injuries to heal, they treated them fast so the column could keep moving. Animals were also cared for at night. Mules, the workhorses of the Roman march, were groomed and fed. Their hooves were checked, packs rebalanced and wounds dressed. Cart axles were oiled, loose harnesses were repaired. If even one cart failed the next day, it could set back the entire column. Maintenance at night was not an option, it was survival. Later in the evening, the orders for the following day were passed down the chain of command. From the praetorium, tribunes delivered plans to centurions, who then read them aloud to their concubinae, the 8-man teams who lived and marched together. These briefings were matter of fact. If someone was to be punished, it was announced then. If an execution was to be carried out, it happened with quiet ceremony. There were no public humiliations, only reminders that the army functioned under absolute discipline. What defined Roman knight, more than anything else though, was silence. The legion enforced a strict code of sound discipline. No laughter echoed through the tents. No singing drifted over the walls. Even footsteps were measured. It was not fear, it was control. The enemy might be nearby, listening, but more than that, internal discipline had to hold strong. An army that could remain silent in the dark could act with unity in the chaos of dawn. Guards were posted in scheduled shifts. Each night was divided into 4 vigilia, watch periods of roughly 3 hours. Each century was assigned its watch, and within it, individual soldiers took their turns. They were given the day's password, the tessera, and were expected to report it at checkpoints during their patrols. If a guard failed to give the correct tessera, he was assumed compromised. If he fell asleep, the punishment was immediate and merciless, death by stoning, administered not by officers, but by his own brothers in arms. His concubinium carried it out together. It was a harsh bond, but one that drove home the responsibility each man carried. One failure in the night could doom the entire legion. Even while lying down, soldiers kept their shields at arm's reach, their gladius tucked close, and their sandals ready to slide on in an instant. Everyone knew exactly what to do if the alarm was sounded, where to go, which gate to defend, which formation to fall into. There was no confusion, no shouting. The entire machine could wake and move as one. The enemy might choose to attack at night, but if they did, they would not find easy targets. They would find the most organized, most disciplined military force of the ancient world, awake, ready and waiting, because the Roman legion did not wait to be surprised. It was the one doing the surprising, and so, after 24 hours, what seemed like just a military march revealed itself to be a flawless choreography of survival, strategy, and total domination of time and space. The Roman legion wasn't just made of soldiers, it was made of planning, discipline, and a doctrine that could transform any hostile terrain into an extension of the empire. At once machine, beast, and city, it marched like a mechanism, breathed like a